All right, I
There
think
we
it's
go.
working now.
Ah, it worked. I hate starting Instagram lives because my heart always stops a little bit. Because I'm like, oh no, what if it doesn't work? How are you? It's good
Get
to
it
see your
together,
face.
Facebook. Get it together,
Yeah,
Zuckerberg.
seriously, all
Maybe if
that
we,
money they have and they,
yeah, maybe if we give him like 10 billion more dollars, then he can
yeah.
actually get things to work right.
Maybe if the Atlantic Council can just advise them better, they can have like better functioning social media tools. So Ben, where are you coming to us from?
I'm in Quito, which is the capital of Ecuador.
All right, so you're still in Ecuador, and I have to say, like anybody who's watching, we have a lot of people watching and commenting. They're really excited to hear what you have to say. I highly encourage you after this Instagram live, which you should stay on, to go check out Ben's reporting for the Gray Zone. You have done both video reports as well as like written investigative reports, both like well worth reading and watching from Ecuador. So I want to talk about the region more broadly, but like let's start in Ecuador since you've done some really explosive stuff there. There was elections over the weekend that you were covering. Why don't you kind of lay out for everyone who was running, like you know where they lie ideologically, and why it's so significant for Ecuador to be having this election right now, like what it means for the country's future.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me on, Rania. I have to say, it's been incredible. I have done a lot of interviews here, but almost entirely, I think all of them have been with Spanish language outlets, and you're the only person in English who asked me, because unfortunately, in English language media, especially in the US, no one cares about this, even though this stuff is extremely important. And why is it important? It's important because right now we're seeing the resurgence of progressive movements, left-wing, even socialist movements in Latin America. In the early 2000s, really for the first time in modern history, Latin Americans were allowed to have their democratic voices heard, and they elected socialists and other left-wing presidents. Of course, Latin America was colonized by the Spanish and the Portuguese, and there was hundreds of years of struggles against European colonialism. And then throughout the 1900s, the 20th century, the United States kind of colonized. Well, in the 1800s, in the 1820s, the United States declares the Monroe Doctrine that says Latin America is its imperial backyard. And then, of course, people probably know in the 1900s, there were a series of military dictatorships during the Cold War, and the CIA overthrew elected socialists like Salvador Allende in Chile on the first 9/11 attack in 1973. And there are many examples in Guatemala in 1953. So for the first time in the early 2000s, Latin Americans were finally allowed to vote in these governments that represented them, that were populist governments, that were using the natural resources not to benefit North American corporations, but actually to use those natural resources like oil and minerals and agriculture to fund social programs, to help people, to fight poverty, to build infrastructure. This is still one of the poorest regions of the entire world. So this gave rise to a movement known as the pink tide. Now that's a term used in English. They don't say that in Spanish, but and it's kind of marketing, right? But it's a real force. We're talking about the wave of progressive governments. So you had Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. You had Lula da Silva in Brazil, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Rafael Correa here in Ecuador. So there are these progressive, in many cases, socialist leaders, Cristina de Kirchner and also her husband, Nestor Kirchner in Argentina. Basically every government in Latin America had a progressive leader except Colombia, of course, which Hugo Chavez famously called the Israel of Latin America.
They've also, to be clear, I'm pretty sure Colombian leadership has proudly proclaimed themselves that as well. Like
Yeah, they're proud of
they
it.
took that comment with pride. Yeah.
We love settler colonialism, and we love, being a lackey of the U.S. So anyway, the point is that movement that was kind of the golden era of modern Latin American history was beaten back. It was beaten back by right-wing oligarchs in Latin America who have controlled the economies, controlled large parts of the countries for many decades, and then, of course, by meddling by the United States. And this is something that was going on not just under Trump, but especially under Barack Obama. And many of the people in the Obama State Department who oversaw these policies are back under the Biden administration. And we saw that in 2009, under the Hillary Clinton State Department, there was a military coup against the elected not even socialists, the elected progressive government in Honduras, in Central America, of Manuel Zelaya. And we saw that in 2012, there was a US-backed soft coup, a parliamentary coup against the leader, Fernando Lugo. And we saw, the most egregious example in terms of the impact on the region was the US-backed soft coup against the progressive government in Brazil in 2016, where we saw these absurd impeachment proceedings accusing the Workers' Party government in Brazil of corruption, being led, the proceedings were being led by the most corrupt people imaginable, like people who had literally been charged with murder, but because they had parliamentary immunity, they couldn't be thrown in prison. Like, we're talking about like wealthy murderers who like ordered people to, like ordered assassins, hitmen to execute their opponents. They were the ones leading this fake anti-corruption proceeding to remove, with the backing of the FBI and the CIA, to remove the elected left-wing government in Brazil. So anyway, the point is that all of these movements were beaten back, except there were 3 governments that held on, which John Bolton, under the Trump administration, deemed the troika of tyranny. And they're called the troika of tyranny because they refused to bow to the US and refused to allow Washington to determine who their leaders will be. And that's Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. So, but the point is that in the past few years, some of these governments have been coming back. And ironically, the Trump administration was just so aggressive and so racist and so colonialist that it actually helped empower some left-wing forces. So we saw in Argentina, the left wing came back in Argentina. The left wing is in power for the first time in 50 years in Mexico. The left wing came back in other parts of Latin America, and they formed the kind of new organization called the Grupo de Puebla, and they're trying to bring back the pink tide. And Ecuador is a key element. That's why the election here is so important, because Ecuador, not only because the former president Rafael Correa provided so many programs for the people of Ecuador, fighting poverty, drastically reducing poverty, creating universal education that's free and very high quality, providing tens of thousands of scholarships that were worth millions of dollars, and also creating a much more robust universal healthcare system, something that in the U.S., we dream about, but we can't ever have. So, I mean, that's important for the people of Ecuador. But then there's also the more important factors in terms of geopolitics and the reasons why Washington was so desperate about beating back the pink tide, because Ecuador was a key part of these regional institutions that were aimed at integrating Latin America. Because as I was saying earlier, Latin America for centuries has been dominated by foreign colonialists. So in the early 2000s, for the first time, Latin American countries, during the pink tide, this progressive wave, they created new organizations, political and economic organizations, that unified Latin American countries and excluded the United States. So the most important of these was called the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance. And ALBA also means dawn, so it's a symbolic name. And this was created in 2004 by Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and by Cuba under then Fidel Castro. And it unified Bolivia, Nicaragua, Ecuador under Rafael Correa, Honduras until the coup there, Venezuela, Cuba, all the progressive governments.
It's like a nightmare. It's like an American nightmare.
Well, and it's an American nightmare because it wasn't just a political bloc. It was an economic bloc. And all of these countries were saying, wait, it doesn't make sense. Why do we do all of our trade with the United States? Why don't we do trade with our neighbors?
Yeah, we have all the shit that we need to trade. Like all this raw materials are in Latin America.
and what was so-called threatening to the U.S. was that they weren't trading in dollars. Most countries in the world, the dollar is the de facto global reserve currency. So most countries in the world, if they want to trade with another country, they do the trade in dollars. Even if Germany is going to trade with India, they're going to trade in dollars. Like it doesn't matter that neither country.
Right, and people, I think that people often miss how vital that is to the U.S. The fact that we have a dollar-based oil economy, right? The oil is traded with dollars. So even Lebanon, right? Everything they import, they buy with dollars. It's like common practice. So it's a really, really big deal, like what you're saying, when these countries came together, formed a bloc, and we're like, why the fuck are we trading in dollars? Like we don't
Yeah,
even need to do that with each other. Yeah.
and what's incredible is the ALBA, I mean, they were using currencies, but then they also tried new forms of trade. So for instance, Brazil, that are non-dollar based and that are value based. So Brazil has certain resources like oil or a better example is Venezuela, because there's so much oil. So Venezuela has a ton of oil and Brazil has coffee beans. So what they would do is they wouldn't even trade, they wouldn't even use currency. Venezuela would give oil to Brazil and Brazil would give coffee beans to Venezuela. So you just remove even the necessity of dollars or of any currency from those transactions. So the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance, it's called the ALBA TCP, which is trade for the people as opposed to free trade, like trade for the people.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
And the United States, of course, and this is under Barack Obama, it was furious, and oligarchs in Latin America, many of which are descendants of the kind of colonialists, and they made a lot of their wealth through imports. So many oligarchs in Latin America, they're totally useless. They don't produce anything. All they do is, I mean, that's true in Lebanon. They just import a ton of products and just make a huge amount of wealth. So there was a series of campaigns. In fact, my colleagues and I from the Gray Zone, we went to Honduras in 2019, and we interviewed the former president, Manuel Zelaya, on the 10th anniversary of the US-backed coup. And he said explicitly that the United States government threatened him, saying, you cannot be an ally of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and you cannot join the ALBA, or you're going to have problems. And Honduras joined ALBA, and they overthrew him. A military coup overthrew him. So, and then here in Ecuador, fast forwarding a bit, there is currently a right-wing government that is extremely corrupt, very authoritarian. It has persecuted all political opposition. It has exiled members of the left-wing Correísta movement. And what did this US-backed government do? One of the first things it did is withdraw Ecuador from the ALBA, from the Bolivarian Alliance. And it also, I mentioned there are other regional organizations. There was another one that was an attempt to kind of make a Latin American United Nations called UNASUR, which is the Union of South American Nations. And that is a political organization. The ALBA was an economic one. UNASUR was created to, if there's an issue between, like a territorial dispute or a political conflict between Bolivia and Venezuela, between Ecuador and Peru or something like that, right? Then all of the countries in UNASUR, instead of going to the United Nations, instead of going to the United States as an arbiter, they would use their own political body, UNASUR, like the African Union, and they would use that body to negotiate. Instead, and because why if they're neighbors and they're in Latin America, why do they need foreigners to help them negotiate? So that was the plan, and it was a very successful organization. So one of the other things that these US-backed right-wing governments that came in, they all withdrew from UNASUR to try to destroy UNASUR. So Ecuador was the capital of UNASUR. That's why this country is so important, because not only for the people of Ecuador is it important, because I'll talk about how horrible life has become under this neoliberal regime, but which has 8% approval rating, by the way, but also because Ecuador was the political capital of these regional institutions, and the US-backed regime here withdrew from UNASUR and the ALBA, and it kicked out the headquarters, which was located here in Quito, in the capital.
Damn. So this is why, like, I love the way you explain it, because you explain it not just as an Ecuador issue, but regionally why this is so important. But I do want to get to some like things that are particular to Ecuador, because what I find, well, two things. First, I think it's interesting. This is more just an observation that you can expand on, but I do think it's interesting that with countries like Ecuador or Honduras, it's not even like anything else had to happen except for neoliberal assholes to come to power for people to reject it. Like, that's all that had to happen, is like you had this neoliberal, I mean, this guy Lenin Moreno has done so much damage to Ecuador. You can see it in their lack of ability to respond to COVID for the past year properly, where you had people like collapsing in the streets. And you have like all this debt, and you know, Ecuador took on all this debt under him, like these IMF, I think there was like some IMF loans, and then like the political persecution, and just like the lack, you know, the removing social safety net style stuff. So I think that's interesting that in the cases of like Ecuador and Bolivia after the fascist coup, what you really saw was like people saw what neoliberalism looks like and they were like, hell no. And so you have these elections that took place where people came out and rejected the neoliberalism. But what's so interesting about Ecuador, which you exposed in your recent piece, is that rather than just only backing a right-wing candidate versus like the Correa-aligned candidate who did win, the U.S. sort of like regime change network of like civil society groups that the National Endowment for Democracy funds has also cultivated this like pseudo-leftist. Like, I don't think there's a parallel. I can't think, maybe there is, but I can't think of a parallel to this. So why don't you explain that like in more detail, what I'm talking about? Because people who are watching might not have any clue what I'm referring to.
Well, absolutely. First of all, I'll say you mentioned Lenin Moreno, just to understand really quickly just how bad things are in Ecuador. So Lenin Moreno came in, and he was the former vice president of the leftist leader, Rafael Correa, the most popular leader in modern Ecuadorian history. With his socialist policies, he launched something he called the Citizens' Revolution, which is still a very vibrant force. And Correísmo, the political movement named after him, is the dominant political force in Ecuador. There's not really anything that challenges it, which is why they have to use so many undemocratic tactics to prevent Correístas from coming back to power. So Lenin Moreno was the vice president of Correa, and he was elected by the people thinking that he was going to follow in the footsteps of Correa. And he totally did a 180. He allied with his right-wing opponents in the election, including the main right-wing leader, Guillermo Lasso, who is a banker. He's one of the richest people in all of Ecuador. Everyone knows that he hides millions and millions of dollars in offshore bank accounts, extremely corrupt. So he formed a coalition with Lenin Moreno, and he implemented all these neoliberal reforms. He imprisoned and exiled Correísta leaders, including democratically elected politicians like mayors and members of the National Assembly. He took control of all of the media. And that's what's also incredible about this massive opposition to this government, is that it's rooted in real experience. Because if you watch TV here, every single media outlet is controlled by this neoliberal regime. Every single media outlet, all of the private networks, because they're all controlled by right-wing oligarchs, and all of the state networks. And it's all nonstop anti-propaganda, just spreading lies. The latest lie is they claim that Correa and the candidate representing Correísmo, a young left-wing economist named Andrés Arauz, who won first place in the first round of the election. I'll get to him in a second. The latest lie was all these media outlets are claiming that they're funded by this Colombian guerrilla group called the ELN, the National Liberation Army, which is an insane lie. There's no evidence. And what's so funny is that lie is just a recycled lie that they used against Correa like 10 years ago. They claimed he was funded by the FARC, which is a different Colombian guerrilla group. I mean, so their lies aren't even original. But the point is that despite the authoritarian control that this government has, despite its betrayal of the people, well, actually, not despite, because of all of this, because he also betrayed Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks publisher who was living as a political prisoner effectively in the Ecuadorian embassy. And he was there because Rafael Correa, the leftist leader, gave him asylum when he knew that the U.S. was trying to imprison him. So Lenin Moreno, the U.S. puppet, extremely corrupt leader. By the way, we know there are these papers that were leaked called the INA papers, which show that this current U.S.-backed leader has millions of dollars he stole from Ecuador and is hiding it in offshore accounts. So extremely corrupt, and it's clear that he's a puppet of the U.S. He met with Mike Pompeo multiple times. In fact, Mike Pompeo and Mike Pence and Trump all met with Moreno, and Mike Pompeo took multiple trips to Ecuador for the first time in Ecuador's history that a U.S. Secretary of State visited multiple times. Because he's a total puppet. And in fact, 2 weeks before the election, Lenin Moreno visited Washington, D.C. for a week, just 2 weeks before the election, and he met with the head
His handlers.
He met with the head of Joe Biden's Western Hemisphere team for his National Security Council. He also met with the director of the IMF, and under Lenny Moreno, the government has taken more than $6 billion in IMF loans that it's not going to be able to pay off. So all of these policies have led to Lenny Moreno having an 8% approval rating and a 91% disapproval rating. So he's the least popular leader.
Yeah, that's like really bad. That's shockingly low. Like he must have really just been, like even the oligarchs didn't like him if his approval rating is that low.
Yeah, and the reality, you mentioned, Rania, the reality has been brutal, not only in the economy. Last year, the GDP shrunk by 11% in 1 year. And there was COVID, but that's like really bad, even with COVID. And furthermore, you mentioned that here COVID has been a total disaster. So while people are suffering because poverty levels have doubled, poverty has doubled to 56% of the country is now living in poverty, according to the United Nations. Over half. And extreme poverty is over 1/3. It's around 36%. So the poverty has doubled. And in terms of deaths, because of COVID, Ecuador has one of the highest per capita deaths in the entire world, death rates in the entire world. It's up there with Brazil and the United States. Like great work. I mean, like the great models. So anyway, that brings us to the election. And in the election, for many months, polls were showing that there were two main candidates. The left-wing candidate, who is representing the Citizens' Revolution launched by Rafael Correa, he's a young 36-year-old economist named Andrés Arauz. He's a brilliant guy. He speaks Spanish, English, French, and Russian fluently.
Wow.
I saw him do an interview in Russian, which I'm sure scares the U.S. as well. And another thing about Arauz is that he wants to bring back the regional institutions that I mentioned, like the ALBA and UNASUR. He also wants to work closely with China, because under Rafael Correa, they made a lot of business agreements with China to build infrastructure, because, shocker, if you make an agreement with China, they'll actually make your bridge, and they might even do it like before the deadline. Whereas if you sign a deal with the U.S., they won't even finish the bridge, and they'll be over budget, and it'll never happen.
And the U.S. will make you, and the U.S. will kneecap you while they're doing it. They'll steal or they'll destroy your economy while they're doing it. Whereas China doesn't actually enforce these, or China doesn't force these economic conditions onto countries when they go into these deals with them, whereas the U.S. does. But anyway,
well, and in fact,
that's
China,
a huge threat. Yeah.
Yeah, and China has actually forgiven a lot of debt in developing countries, especially in Latin America, especially Cuba. So the point is that Andrés Arauz represents a return to the socialist Correísta movement with an anti-imperialist, with a nationalist foreign policy. And on the other side, the other main candidate, according to the polls, was this right-wing banker I mentioned, Guillermo Lasso, a total oligarch, corrupt. This guy ran for president 3 times and he always lost because he's just so unpopular. And he's got Botoxes. I mean, he's just he's the whole thing. So, but what was interesting though, is that he came in 3rd place. There was another candidate who was people didn't think that they didn't think that he had a chance, because all the polls showed him consistently in 3rd place. But before the election, I published an article about this guy. His name is Yaku Perez, because he's very suspicious. And I had been hearing things from people here in Ecuador, talking to people. I started doing research about this guy. And it was clear at first that he was in the campaign to try to take away votes from the left, because he is running a pseudo-left-wing campaign, as you alluded to. He's running as an environmentalist, pretending to be progressive, and in many ways using these kind of neoliberal identitarian talking points that the United States uses. So he is from an indigenous community, but he's not a progressive indigenous leader. He's a very reactionary indigenous leader, as we'll get to. He supported right-wing coups across Latin America. His political party, Pachakutik, is funded by the United States and has been supported by a CIA cutout called the National Democratic Institute, which is an arm of the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED. And so he has so many very shady links. So I published an article about him before the election saying that people I was talking to were saying that This guy is in the campaign to try to take away votes from the left. Well, not only did he take away votes from the left, he actually came in second place, which is interesting because it's a reflection. One, it's in some ways it's a very bad thing, of course, but in some ways it's actually kind of a good sign, because it's a sign that the right-wing oligarchy in Ecuador is so discredited that the two candidates who were the most popular candidates in the election are the socialist and the fake leftist. So the right was totally rejected in this campaign, totally rejected. Guillermo Lasso, everyone assumed he was going to come in second and go to the second round of the election. He was totally defeated and came in third place. But that raises the question: who is this guy, Yaku Perez, who came out of nowhere? What does he represent? And there's going to now be a second round of the election in April, on April 11th, between the socialist candidate, Arauz, and the fake leftist, Yaku Perez. What are they going to say? What are they going to argue about? What I'll say is I can say a few things. Yaku Perez, the reason that he became a candidate and the kind of crux of his campaign is he's criticizing the Correísta movement for being extractivist, as he calls it. And this is getting into the kind of like Naomi Klein left, right? Like there's this kind of so-called green left that's emerging. And
it's a global, let's be clear. It's a global north left too, from rich countries that are rich because they stole resources, like from poor countries that they made poor.
And slavery. They're rich because of slavery, colonialism, and So the thing is that there's this. Of course, I support environmentalism as a political, important issue, but you have to balance it with other issues. And the reality is that in Latin America and other third world countries, regions of the world that were colonized and were underdeveloped and de-developed by colonialism, these countries need to use their natural resources to develop. They don't have the option of colonialism, of wars of aggression and slavery to develop their countries, like the United States and like Western Europe. So what they do is they use their natural resources to fund social programs. We saw this in Venezuela, and in Venezuela, the U.S. blockade and sanctions, and then the drop of oil hurt that process. It was Chavez. We saw it here in Korea. Ecuador has large oil reserves. It also has very significant mineral reserves, including gold, silver, tungsten, a lot of other things, copper. And they can mine those resources and then sell them, and the government uses those. Instead of letting a private corporation like ExxonMobil take its oil and make money off of it, the government will extract the oil and then sell it and then use that money to fund free healthcare for everyone, free education, and develop the country with infrastructure projects. That was very successful.
It's basically developing colonized countries using their own natural resources as a national, like nationalizing their natural resources. That's what's happening here. And it strikes me as very odd when I see leftists in the global north, in these wealthy countries, like where we grew up, that are rich because they stole and colonized and because of imperialism. It just strikes me as odd to see them get like their panties all up in a bunch because like Ecuador is going to give free healthcare to its citizens by using its natural resources. And they call this extractivism or what is, I think Naomi Klein once called it
petropopulism.
Right. And it
so
just seems really, it's condescending, and it's also misplaced because these are small countries. They're not even the ones that are doing the polluting. I mean, at this point, pollution is going to continue to happen. It's the global north that pollutes the most. It's U.S. that pollutes the most. It's the U.S. military that pollutes the most. So it just strikes me as odd to focus your attention at like and disdain at poor countries that it's like a penny in a bucket, in a very large bucket of like pollution, when you're not talking about the biggest polluter, which is like the U.S. military. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there because there's some people making comments about it as well, saying, well, Perez doesn't want to blow up mountains for extraction. The other guy does. And it's
all right. Well, we'll get into this in a second, because I'm also extremely skeptical about his professed opposition to extractivism. I think it's a marketing scheme. If the people promoting people surrounding him, political allies, they all want more extractivism, but they want the wealth of that extractivism to go to global North corporations, specifically North American U.S. corporations. So I get that this is a complex issue because, of course, we have to combat climate change. But like you mentioned, the reality is, if you look at the numbers, people say, well, we should care about the science, the climate science. Okay, I care about the climate science. Let's look at the numbers. Ecuador, Venezuela, Brazil, these countries, well, Brazil's a big country, so it's a little different. Ecuador and Venezuela, which have significant oil reserves in Latin America, are responsible for a minuscule, we're talking about less than 1% of global, much less than 1% of global carbon expenditure. I mean, the United States, Western Europe, Japan, Korea, these are the countries that are responsible for most of the pollution and putting carbon into the atmosphere. But of course, they're not the ones being pressured to stop extractivism. I mean, a fringe left, like, you know, people like us who are ignored by mainstream media will say that, but you won't hear mainstream politicians, including the most progressive of Democrats, saying that we have to stop extractivism in the United States. It's only poor countries in the global South that are that unlike the global North, are going to use that extractivism to benefit the people and fight poverty. So, I mean, it's so hypocritical. And the other reality is, look, this extractivism is going to happen regardless of who's in power. If you think Yaku Perez is going to stop extractivism, I'm sorry, you're extremely misguided. Let's talk about why. First of all, why did I write that article before the election? I was very suspicious because I saw that a website called America's Quarterly was heavily promoting Yaku Perez, saying that not only was he the new face of Ecuador's left, as they said, they also claimed that he was more left-wing than the Correísta movement, the socialist movement here in Ecuador. And I said, okay, well, what is this website, America's Quarterly? America's Quarterly is the publication of a right-wing corporate lobby group funded by U.S. corporations called the America Society Council of the Americas, ASCOA, A-S-C-O-A. ASCOA is one of the most infamous organizations in Latin America because it is funded by every major U.S. corporation. I'll name some of the corporations that fund this so-called NGO, this think tank. Chevron, ExxonMobil, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Apple, Google, Facebook, every big corporation. Chiquita
Chevron,
Bananas.
to be fair, Chevron is famous for wanting to clean up the environment.
Yeah, exactly.
Chiquita
Bananas.
Has a great history in the region. Has a great history. The United Fruit Company, lovely history in Latin America.
And not just the history, a continued record of supporting Colombian paramilitaries that kill union organizers, that use slave labor, child labor. So, by the way, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin also support ESCOA. So you have to ask yourself, why is this organization funded by the arms industry and by fossil fuel corporations and banks? Why is it so committed to convincing us that Yaku Perez is the real left-wing candidate? So that was the first red flag to me, the bad red flag, if you will, right?
It's like a flashing, like it's like more than a red flag. What's more than a red flag? It's like got a siren on it. Jesus.
So I started looking into this guy. I started looking at what he had said about other countries in the region. This guy, again, he's an indigenous leader in Ecuador. He supported the coup in Bolivia against Evo Morales, which was led by racist far-right Christian extremists who called indigenous people satanic and massacred them. And he supported the coup, and not only did he support the coup, for the entire year during the coup, he was totally silent because he supported it. And it's not just my opinion. Yaku Perez, this indigenous leader here in Ecuador, was not invited to the inauguration when in Bolivia in October, the left-wing movement, the socialist movement, the movement towards socialism, which is Evo Morales' party. Evo Morales is the first and only ever indigenous leader in Bolivia. His party won in a massive landslide after resisting the coup, after the election was delayed 3 times. And his party won, and which represents the indigenous community in Bolivia. And in the inauguration in Bolivia, they invited, the MAS movement invited Ecuadorian indigenous leaders. Numerous Ecuadorian indigenous leaders attended. Yaku Perez was not invited. And when asked why, Evo Morales said, Perez was not invited because he supported the dictatorship against us. So
Yeah.
that was strike one. I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. That's a huge, talk about red flags, but bad red flags, like not good red flags. So the second example, he supported the coup attempt in Venezuela. He called for overthrowing Nicolas Maduro, the elected president. He also called for overthrowing the government of Nicaragua, the Sandinista government, and
This guy
supported
sounds
the
like a
U.S.-backed
neocon.
coup.
He sounds like a neocon.
Well,
Like,
but Rania, we were talking about this kind of like new, like green NGO left, because
yeah.
Yaku Perez is the candidate of the NGOs and like the upper middle class elites who think they fancy themselves cosmopolitan and liberals. At the same time, they don't want more taxes. Like Correa is the candidate of the working class of poor people, but the reality is in Latin America, you know, it's a more conservative region of the world. Abortion is not very popular, and the majority of working class people don't support abortion, but there's like a very strong populist left. Correa represents that populist left. Yaku Perez represents the NGO liberals who are environmentalists, who are pro-abortion, and who work with NGOs that are funded by the United States and the European Union. And that represents like the upper middle class elites who speak English, who studied in the United States, who support the Democratic Party in the United States. I mean, he really represents, you said that you haven't heard of this before. Well, actually, this is not new. We saw this happen in Brazil, and we see it happening in Nicaragua as well, and Venezuela. This is the fake NGO left.
Right, and I
the
should
United
know,
States,
right? This is also the case across the Middle East, like, as well, right?
like the people who say that they're against Hezbollah because they say like Hezbollah is misogynist.
Right,
And like clearly
right.
there's contradictions, like, you know, some of these Shia liberation movements do have more conservative politics, but
They're religious,
yeah, but they represent a mass base of working people, unlike the fucking I don't know if I can cuss, I'm sorry. I already did, but
No, you can. Cuss all you want. Cuss all you
unlike
want.
these
There's no rules
NGO
here.
elite liberals. Like that's not a working class movement. So in Brazil, in the 2016 soft coup, a lot of these NGO liberals supported the coup against Dilma Rousseff because they claimed that the Workers' Party was corrupt. And they also criticized some of the, we saw throughout in Brazil and Ecuador and Bolivia, under these left-wing governments, we saw that there was this AstroTurf campaign. And it's a complex issue because, look, if you're developing your country and building infrastructure, you're going to have to do some environmental damage. That's the reality. But people in the global north don't understand the poverty we're talking about. It infuriates me. We're talking about people who live with fucking mud roads, and they live in houses without
like no
sewage.
no infrastructure, like at all.
People have no idea what they're talking about.
No access to, like, you want to talk about no access to healthcare? Like, this is like, you have to walk several miles to get to a clinic that has like Band-Aids.
Yeah, I mean,
like I've been of poverty.
I've been in rural Honduras, rural Nicaragua. Like I've been in like areas outside of like the major cities here in Ecuador, in Venezuela. Like we're talking about areas that are extremely poor, levels of poverty you don't ever see in rich countries in the global north because they went through that process of colonization and development. And of course, they're very unequal countries, but the level of poverty in the U.S., which is, I mean, it's pretty astounding considering how rich the U.S. is, but it's still nowhere near the level. Like, I mean,
there's like little pockets in the U.S. that have some similarities, a little bit, but what you're talking about, like I obviously I haven't spent time in Latin America, but like Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, rural areas where people are really disconnected from state services completely. It's like another world. So it's like people in the global north, as I'm sure you've experienced as well, they don't have an understanding of what it means for someone's level of freedom. Like in the global north, we place all this emphasis, because we're such like a libertarian capitalist society, we place all this emphasis on political freedoms. Everything's all about political freedom. We don't count economic anything as a freedom. Like we don't view shelter, access to water, access to like basic schooling, access to like even like the most limited amount of healthcare. we don't view that as a form of freedom or a right, if you will. So like when these societies, especially in Latin America, change so drastically in a positive way because of socialist policies, like people just don't know what that actually means on the average person's life. But it's actually like a life and death situation.
And, you know, I live in Nicaragua, which is actually the poorest country in Latin America, although it's not as obvious because the inequality is much lower. And it has one of the best infrastructure development projects in all of Latin America because the government actually spends its money on helping the people. And I have talked to a lot of people in rural Nicaragua and even in the cities, and they're hardcore Sandinistas. They will die. People have told me, and they actually have done this, that they will put their lives on the line and fight to the death to defend Sandinismo, the socialist, because before Sandinismo, they lived in the middle of nowhere with no water, with no electricity, with dirt roads. The government never did anything for them other than take money from them, tax them. And now they have roads, they have free education, they have free healthcare, they have electricity, they have water, they have job opportunities. Like, and these are people who, they have a lot to lose. So
Yeah.
and
actually, they also remember what it was. They still remember what it was like before, or their parents told them what it was like before.
Yeah, I remember talking to a guy who was born up in the northern part of Nicaragua on the border of Honduras, which is one of the poorest regions. And he told me, an older guy who remembers the Sandinista Revolution in 1979, and he was involved in it. And he told me, he said, I will absolutely die for Sandinismo. And like, that's a common sentiment. And people, they haven't experienced such desperation and such a drastic change in their lives. And like, I mean, I can't even imagine in the United States, if we had universal health care, Medicare for all, imagine how much people would love the politician. They would be like, you can never say anything bad about the politician. Like if Bernie managed to do it or something. And that's just healthcare. Like that's important, but we're talking about totally different levels here. So like,
yeah. And I mean,
like
I
understanding.
Go ahead.
Well, so just like understanding why these movements in Latin America, like here in Ecuador, Correísmo, or Chavismo in Venezuela. The same thing in Venezuela. I've heard so many poor people when I did interviews in working class communities in Venezuela, in these barrios out in the outskirts of Caracas. People, they often say that. They're like, I would die for Chavismo. Like Hugo Chavez, like changed the lives of my family forever. Like it will, and what's also interesting about that is it empowers people in a way it's difficult to appreciate because they now have something to lose, so they're going to fight for it. So that's why we've seen these U.S. coup attempts failed in Venezuela and Nicaragua and Bolivia, because people have physically seen their lives get better. They feel the difference. It's not just ideological for them. And I think that's why here in Ecuador, so many people have rejected the government, because they can physically see the way in their lives just in 4 years have gotten exponentially worse. So they now have something to gain again, because they actually have been given a taste of what it could be like if you have a left-wing government that represents you. So they're going to fight for it. And the thing is, in the United States, is one of the reasons people are often so attracted to this kind of libertarian anarchist view that sees the state as the enemy is because the state never does anything to help people in the United States. It always punishes people. So you can't imagine what it would be like to actually have the state.
If your side controlled it. Yeah, if your side controlled it.
And imagine what would happen is if your side controlled it and the state helps you and made the lives of you and all of your friends and loved ones better, of millions of people for 4, 8, 10 years, and then that's taken away. People are going to fight hard to bring it back. And that's exactly what's happening in Ecuador.
And that's definitely something that people in the global north can't understand. Of course, the Middle East is different because what you're talking about is actual socialist movements. We don't have socialist movements anymore in the Middle East. If we do, they don't have any power in any significant way whatsoever. But there is a parallel in the sense that, there's like in South Lebanon, Shias in South Lebanon were under Israeli occupation, being tortured and living in extremely poor conditions. They were like the peasants of the country. Treated very terribly. There was a lot of bigotry against them. And, after Hezbollah kicked out Israel, Like their areas were developed, they have roads, they have hospitals, they have like an economy that functions for them. And so people know what they have to lose. And that's, of course, an understanding and mentality that Americans can't understand, because there isn't anything that we've ever had like been given to lose, like, or that we've like fought for, you know, that people fought for or lived in like really desperate circumstances and fought for to lose, at least not in our lifetimes, I should say.
Well, I mean, there's civil rights is a clear example, and you can see like voter suppression.
That wasn't in our
Yeah,
lifetime,
yeah.
right? But that also,
Well, no,
like,
well, I'm just saying, like with voter suppression, yeah. But that's still an example, like you said, of how in this extremely neoliberal capitalist society in the United States, the only thing that we can talk about are political rights, and those are important. Like, of course, we should oppose voter suppression, but we don't ever talk about economic rights because we don't have economic rights. There are no economic rights. You're not guaranteed healthcare. You're not guaranteed a job.
And you can't have, like, in my opinion, I don't think you can have democracy without those rights. Like, it's like when I look at a country like Cuba, you know, the US makes this really big thing about how like people don't have the same political rights. Although locally, I know that there is a lot of voting for like local council in Cuba. But regardless, like Cuba doesn't have the political rights that we have in America, right? Like, that said, Cubans have different kinds of rights that we don't get in America. Why don't we include that in the toolbox of what we consider democracy? Like, why isn't, because for me, like, political rights are important. Free speech is important. But so is like the right to live by accessing medical care. Like, why aren't those things on the same level? And they should be. And I think that's one of the biggest problems on the American left, among other things, is that we don't view those things as the same. Like, we don't, like, people on the American left, obviously as a leftist, you care about economic rights, but that, like, it's like political rights are seen as up here and economic rights are seen as like ideal, but like they fall kind of more right here. Whereas no, like these things are equivalent. Like they should be considered equivalent. And
in fact,
go ahead.
Well, we should also understand how these are written into the constitutions, because what's interesting is in the United States, there's this fetishization of the Constitution as this like perfect document, even though of course it ignores, you know, slavery, the 3/5 compromise, all of that. But what's interesting is that in these revolutionary processes in Latin America, people rewrote their constitutions. They had constitutional referenda, and they have new progressive constitutions in the countries that say that you're these economic rights. It's written into the constitution of the government. So it's unimaginable to think about that in a place like the United States. But it also, you know, when you're talking about that, Rania, maybe also think of how that's reflected in the NGO circles. And this brings us back to Yaku Perez here in Ecuador. Because if you listen to NGOs funded by Western governments, you know, I hate the term NGO. It's a misleading term. I mean, it's not a non-governmental organization if it's funded by government. It's like it's an outsourced governmental organization, right? And in the neoliberal era, after the overthrow of the socialist governments in the Eastern Bloc and the end of the First Cold War, the kind of NGOization was part and parcel of the spread of neoliberalism. Because governments can exercise control while pretending to be independent. That's part of the whole strategy. And the reality is that if you listen to these NGOs like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, they don't consider economic rights to be rights. They only consider political rights and human rights in the abstract way of like the government shouldn't harm you physically, but you don't have the right to healthcare or education or a job. And in fact, Human Rights Watch has explicitly said that it does not consider fighting for the right to unionize a human right. So, I mean, that reflects that neoliberal imperial worldview. And this brings us to Yaku Perez, who here in Ecuador is the candidate of the NGOs. And people say, they say he's the real left-wing candidate. Well, even if you listen to his rhetoric, that's clear it's not true. Here's an example. In an interview, someone asked Yaku Perez, they said, the left-wing Correísta candidate here in Ecuador, the socialist economist Andrés Arauz, he has proposed as a stimulus, if he's president, in response to the crisis here caused by COVID, he's going to give $1,000 checks to 1 million poor and working class families. I should stress, by the way, we're talking about a very poor country compared to the United States.
That's a lot of money. Yeah, that's a lot of money.
In the United States, that would be like the government giving you $10,000 checks. Like we're talking about
Yeah,
a
that's a big
lot
deal.
of money. Like the minimum wage here in Ecuador for people is like $300 or $400 a month. So we're talking about a lot of money. And that's his idea to turbocharge the economy. So they said, Yaku Perez, what do you think of that policy? And he said, I do not support that policy at all. Why? Because if we gave $1,000 to poor families, they'd spend it all on beer in one night. He said that
Like,
on TV.
That's like some Marco Rubio style, like Paul Ryan bullshit. Jesus Christ.
This is the candidate they want us to believe is the real left-wing candidate.
The fake left
And there's
candidate.
so many examples of that.
Wow. They'll
He
spend
also-
it on beer.
He also said in 2017, he said, I don't support the Correista candidate. We didn't know at the time that he would be a traitor, but I don't support the Correista candidate. In 2017, he endorsed the right-wing banker Guillermo Lasso because he said that Correa had been a dictator, and he said it's better to have a banker than a dictator. So he endorsed the right-wing banker. And in this election, 2 days before the election, this right-wing banker candidate, Guillermo Lasso, he said that if Yaku Perez is the presidential candidate, that he will support him. So to me, that says everything. The right-wing banker, one of the richest men in Ecuador, he understands that Yaku Perez's whole progressive environmental thing, it's marketing. It's an NGO shtick. He understands that if Yaku Perez actually managed to win, that he would be the candidate of the Ecuadorian oligarchy and the U.S. empire.
That's absolutely true. On that note, Ben, we're like running out of time. So I just want to note that a lot of people are loving this discussion and are saying, please save it. I will be posting this, assuming Instagram cooperates with me, because I've had some trouble in the past with Instagram. So Instagram Live may not have been the best medium, but it was the quickest one. I wanted to talk to you quickly. I will be posting this to Soapbox. Keep your eye out for it. If I can figure out how to end it. I haven't done an Instagram Live in so long, and I can't figure out where the end button is. I'm like sitting here looking, trying to figure out like where the end button is. I don't know if you have any, Ben, do you have any suggestions? Like where the hell? I'm like
I've
looking
never done an Instagram Live. I've never hosted
You've
it.
only been on them. Yeah. I've had, I had your colleague Anya Parampel on a few months ago to talk about Bolivia, and Instagram was like, sorry, there's an error and we can't post this. So we'll see if Instagram fucks with this interview too. So in fact, I probably should have done this on YouTube instead. That was like kind of stupid on my part, but I think it should be okay. It's worked out before if I can just figure out how to end it. But since we are at the end here, Ben, where can everybody follow your very, very important work on these issues?
Well, thank you. I also just want to call out one comment. Our friend Nayla said free Assange. And, you know, I said this earlier,
yes.
but just to emphasize this, Ecuador has played a key role in protecting Assange and then persecuting him. Under the former leftist president, Correa, the anti-imperialist socialist president, he's the one who gave political asylum to Julian Assange and protected him for 7 years when he was in the Ecuadorian embassy. And it was the US-backed right-wing leader, Lenny Moreno, who betrayed Assange and handed him over. And that was a massive betrayal not only to Assange, but to the people of Ecuador, because he violated Ecuadorian law by allowing British authorities to enter sovereign Ecuadorian soil, which is the embassy, and arrest Julian Assange. So, I mean, for me, that betrayal says so much. It's a kind of microcosm for what has happened to Ecuador in the past few years. If people want to check out my work, they can go to thegrayzone.com, and that's gray with an A. And I'm on Twitter at Benjamin Norton. And I'm here on Instagram, too, at Benjamin D. Norton. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah, Ben, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And again, I will hopefully manage to figure out how to post this. Thank you so much, Ben. Stay safe. I'll be following your reporting, and hopefully we can do this again soon.
I'd love to.
Bye, guys.